So hi, Alexei. What was your first computer?
Hi, Adam. My first computer was probably a Pentium 2 PC that my dad bought for me. I don't really remember the specs. I remember it had like 200 megahertz and I don't know how much memory, and it barely ran Doom 2. So that was probably my first one.
Okay, and why you got it? Because of Doom?
Well, my dad was a programmer at the time, and he switched computers. So he got a better one, and I got this one. And basically, I used it to play Doom for the most part.
Okay, and what kind of programmer was your dad? Which programming languages was he involved back then?
He was involved in C++ mostly.
Okay, cool. And you were back to programming immediately, or just played a lot with the computer?
I played a lot, and I didn't really care about programming for the most part until I was about 16. So I knew I understood that how it worked because my parents were in it, and I just didn't really have any interest. But about when I was 16 years old, I saw this movie called Social Network, and it was about the invention of Facebook. Yeah. And I know that wasn't what the movie was about, but I was really inspired by like the technical aspects of it and how one person can build something like this. And I was very motivated, and I kind of just started learning programming after that.
Hey, cool. With which programming language you started?
Well, even before that, I learned some programming in school. It was QBasic at first, or QBasic. That's like the very first language that I learned. The language I had more or less some experience, I guess, it was Pascal and Delphi. And then eventually I switched to C# around 2012, and since then I was using it for the biggest part of my career.
And when you started with QBasic, when was it, roughly?
Oh, it might have been when I was like 10 years old or something, so quite early.
Which year was it? So like on the time?
It was, let me calculate this. So like 2005 or 6.
Okay, cool. Like so they started with QBasic. What you wrote with QBasic? You had to do this because of school, right?
Yeah. That was just basic calculator stuff.
Yeah. You enjoyed that?
It was quite interesting, yeah. I don't think I loved it, but it was pretty interesting, yeah.
Okay. And then you started with Pascal, you said, right? So this was QBasic was first, and then Turbo Pascal. And why you switched to Turbo Pascal? What you wanted to achieve?
Yeah, it was also because of school. The program was built in such a way that QBasic was kind of like an introductory language.
Okay.
And then you get thrown into Turbo Pascal, and this is like where the real stuff's supposed to begin.
Okay. So so your first programming language by choice was C#, right?
Yeah, basically, I knew at some point I wanted to become a programmer. I just didn't know which language should I pick. And then somebody I knew said, why don't you just pick C#? And there was no reason really, so I just thought, well, I could try it. And I kind of tried it and liked it and stuck with it.
Okay, because social network, I think you should start with PHP. I think
it
had to be.
Yeah.
And you enjoy that, C#?
Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot, and I still like it even to this day.
Okay, and how you started? So you downloaded Visual Studio, or how to start with C#? I'm a Java developer, and at the beginning I didn't like C# and .NET at all. And the reason being, I don't know whether you know the history, is like so I started with Java, and Sun sued Microsoft, and then Microsoft started with the knockoff called .NET, and I was the Java developer, so I know why someone should do this. And then the first C# was a little bit strange, but now C# is really nice, and Microsoft is a completely different company. So now I'm completely changed my mind around C# and Microsoft. I still have no time to learn real C#, but I do all my work with Java.
Right.
How was the process? So you bought Visual Studio, or how you started, or what?
Yeah, back when I started, it already was a lot better than what you described. So there was a free version of Visual Studio that was called Express. It was before they rebranded it to Community and made it better. And so you could download it, and it installed all the dependencies you needed for like C# development. And basically you could use that. Nowadays it's a lot better, and .NET is modular, so you can install it separately from Visual Studio and use any IDE like Visual Studio Code, or there's a JetBrains IDE called Rider for it, and also use it on any operating system as well. And I guess to start, you can just go to, I think it's .net, so like a website .net, and then it just guides you through like the very first steps with any IDE you want, or even without IDE if you want to as well.
There's .NET and .NET Core. So what you should start with .NET Core?
.NET Core. .NET it's very confusing, I know, especially for beginners, but basically .NET is going away. But then .NET Core is getting rebranded back to .NET in, I think, October this year.
Okay.
And basically the way it worked out is .NET used to exist, but then they made .NET Core in parallel to that, and it was supposed to be like a lightweight cross-platform alternative. But it evolved into being essentially feature parity with the original .NET, but it was also cross-platform. So there was no reason to keep the original .NET anymore. And so they kind of stopped working on .NET, but then eventually they realized if they only have .NET Core, why not just call it .NET as well?
Okay.
And so starting from this year, it's going to be just .NET.
So in Java, we have almost a similar confusing, story. We have the Java, that was the first one. And then there was an open source variant called openJDK. And then it was slower and not as good as the Java, but now it is a feature compared with the real Java from Oracle. And now you can have openJDK, which is as good as the real Java. And usually you will just use Java, to get some support, commercial support. But you can totally go with the open source version, which some people call Java or openJDK is like, the open source. And to make it even more confusing, there is a openJDK, flavors for several companies. You can buy from Red Hat, IBM, Azure Systems, Oracle. So this is not like, .NET is special here. Okay, so your history is pretty short. So 2012, you started with C#. And then what you built? What was your first program with C#?
Actually, I think I did some pet projects, and one of the first projects I built was kind of like a chatbot. So you could talk to it, and the way it worked is that it had some database of like keywords, and then when it matched like those keywords based off of how much it matched, it would choose an answer, right? And that's how it worked. I think that was my first project in C#.
And the database was written by you? Is like a flat file, or was it like the real .NET?
It was actually, you can say it was real. It was MS Access. It was the only thing I knew because I worked in the Delphi with that. And I communicated over ado.net, I think it's called, which is pretty much like almost raw SQL layer over it. Yeah, so no ORMs or stuff. That was my first experience, I guess.
And MS Access is still around?
I have no idea. I think so. I mean, it has a very like specific market, I think. So.
And in .NET Core, is this like open source database? No, this .NET Core is just .NET Core. There is no database, right?
.NET Core on its own is just the base class library essentially. But there is also, the database layers are kind of separate. But there is also the ORM, for example, that essentially ships in the same release cycle called Entity Framework Core. It's basically an ORM which you can use with almost any relational database. There are plugins for many of them. But then, of course, you can use any database, for example, Postgres, which is open source. Or even SQL Server, which nowadays kind of free and runs on Linux as well. So.
Yeah, actually, in one project, we are running Microsoft SQL Server on Linux. So, and access from Java, but still interesting. And what's about nHibernate? Is still around? So it was big in .NET, what I know. Is Entity Framework more popular than nHibernate, or?
Yeah, it pretty much replaced it. So right now it's either Entity Framework Core, which is like majority of the projects that work with database are going to use this, or Dapper, which is not an ORM at all. It's kind of like a way for you to build raw SQL queries, but in a like safe way. So it like sanitizes them for you, but it also like maps them to objects when you query something. But essentially, you're still building the queries manually while Entity Framework is an ORM. So majority of the projects either use one or the other. There are also some other ORMs and frameworks, but they're very like scarce and few in between.
Okay, cool. So I actually didn't want to talk about it, but it's for us Java developers still interesting. So you are the expert. How to start with .NET? So we should start with the page .NET, right? No, .NET. Dot the real dot and net, which is actually cool. I don't know whether you are aware, there was before .NET, there was a page java.net, and Microsoft started .NET. And this, of course, we didn't like Java developers at all. So like, why they are doing this? This is our page, This was a cool hack. And now this Java.net was actually killed by Oracle. So there is no more Java.net. There's something else. But .NET is actually even cooler. So you should do the .java would be even better. Then the history repeats. Okay, so you should start with .NET, and they will download all the .NET Core dependencies, whatever you need to my machine, which is cross-platform. So it could also work on Apple, Mac.
Yeah, sure.
Cool. And then you can use Visual Studio Code and the Visual Studio Code as an editor, which I use for Java, fine enough. So today morning, I just wrote some code with Visual Studio Code, which is great, just for experimentation. And with Java, we have IntelliJ. And you said IntelliRider?
Yeah. It's just called JetBrains Rider.
JetBrains Rider.
The IntelliJ part.
I know there was Resharper before. Is it gone? Or is it still around?
It's still around. Resharper was an extension, or still is an extension for Visual Studio. But the thing is, it is kind of like Visual Studio kind of wants to get rid of Resharper, so they don't own it, but they want to replace every feature in it with inside of Visual Studio, like built in.
Okay.
And Resharper is built by JetBrains people, so they kind of just don't want to depend on Visual Studio. So all of their effort is now in Rider, which incorporates all the features of Resharper anyway. So you can use Visual Studio with Resharper, but it's always better to just use Rider instead, if you can.
And what's the state of the union in .NET? So it's like the developers still use Visual Studio, or they prefer Visual Studio Code?
Well, it's definitely like back when I started, almost everybody used Visual Studio. Nowadays, I think I don't really know the statistics, but it feels like from talking to people that a lot more are using Rider. I would say maybe like from people I know, about 40-50%, so a big portion. But fewer people use Visual Studio Code, but I still know some people that do, mostly because it's like more lightweight. It's less of an IDE, more of like a very user-friendly text editor, I would say. But still people use it.
That's interesting, because Visual Studio Code for Java is actually pretty decent, and Microsoft spends a lot of time improving that. This is, I would say, an IDE. So I can refactor, I have unit test support. It is, I would say, 80% of a normal Java IDE, so it's pretty decent, actually.
Yeah, with C# you can do all those things too, but maybe it's because I'm comparing to like Rider and Resharper, and there are so many features that are like kind of advanced, like you can extract methods into other classes like in one click, and that you can really do that in Visual Studio Code.
Okay, then it's very similar situation. Okay, so that was your first pet project. What was your next pet project?
Wow, it's hard to remember my next pet project because it was a while. I started like working freelance with C#. So I built some like ad hoc projects for people for very little money, and for the most part it was just to gain experience and try new things. Very popular like jobs, I guess, that people wanted me to do was build some kind of clients to some APIs. Usually it's like social networks like Twitter or Instagram. And for example, there was one where you kind of like analyze the activity on Twitter related to one account and see like who comments, like who posts replies the most, who shares the most, and based off of that, you kind of like you could reward that person or something like this.
Your clients wanted to have C#, or was it your choice? They hired you to solve the problem, or they hired you to solve the problem with C#?
Usually they just hired me to solve the problem. Sometimes some of the projects were libraries where they specifically wanted me to build them in C#, but usually it doesn't matter.
And where was it? In US or?
It was just on websites. So I started off with it was called freelancer.com, so very like obvious place to start. But I didn't like it, and I eventually moved to a website called elance.com, which now doesn't work anymore. They got bought by another company called Upwork, and Upwork is where I ended up working at the end on freelance. But a lot of like clients that I've had, many jobs with are the clients that I found there, but then we kind of worked separately because we already knew each other.
Yeah. And in which country was it?
Well, I live and worked in Ukraine, but my clients were from all over the world.
Okay, cool.
And the website itself, I think, is also somewhere in the US or something.
Okay, cool. Okay, so you started as a freelancer immediately?
Yeah.
And have you studied computer science or something?
When I started, I didn't actually study it before. So it's funny because I got my bachelor's in electronics, which is something not very related to computer science. But then I got my master's in computer science. But I started freelancing 4 years before I started my master's. So it was like, in retrospect, I didn't know much at all back then. So it's kind of surprising that people actually paid me to do anything. But the things that I built, that did work. So I guess that's the only thing that mattered. But yeah.
And you enjoyed that? So building stuff?
Yeah, it was very, very interesting and very enjoyable. Like, I loved the fact that I could build something that others wanted and it solved their problem, and their lives were better because of that.
Yeah, cool. So then you started study. You still enjoyed, the study or the master of computer science study, or was it?
Yeah, but
were you disappointed a bit that it's too dry and too theoretical?
yeah, I was disappointed, and in some aspects, I already had some experience after 4 years of freelancing, so many of the things weren't that new. Like, it's nice to be able to categorize and like structurize your thinking, but I felt quite bored for the most part. So, and also, yeah, because a lot of the things we learned were very theoretical, like you said, and at that point, it was hard for me to figure out how to apply all that. But it's funny because sometime later, I've actually used something that I didn't think was necessary back then, and it was the language theory, like the formal language theory, where you use for parsing like languages, like programming languages or stuff like JSON stuff. So I didn't think I would need this, but then sometime down the line, a few years later, I was like, hey, that actually came in useful.
Yeah. I had exactly the same experience as you. So I also, started freelancing before I actually started, and then I started to study, and I saw, the professor say, hey, the guy had no idea what he's talking about, and it's like what, and I still had to learn, the stuff. Also, it was no more that relevant. And afterwards, now I would really appreciate to study again, and really just for fun, to learn more about compilers and all the stuff which was bored back then. So exactly the same experience. I think it's normal that then after gaining some, experience from real world, it is nice to rethink your theory and you can reapply it even better. So this is what usually happens. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah.
So and then you stopped being freelancer. Why?
I think it's mostly because I didn't really like the this aspect of just, having to find clients all the time. Like my daily workflow was basically I was working on one monitor and then I had another monitor with like the list of an RSS feed actually of jobs open. So when I like the, open jobs that you can bid on. And so I would kind of just monitor it all the time. Even if I was already working on a project, I had to make sure that another one was lined up. And I mean, it wasn't stressful per se, but I didn't really like it. And I wanted to like have something more consistent, so I decided to find a full-time job, and that's how I kind of moved into the industry.
Okay, and now you spend the entire time for one company, right? So you're working for a company.
Yeah.
And since then?
Since then, I'm still doing this.
Yeah,
so
but since then, you spend your time in one company, or you change companies?
Oh no, I've changed company, so I'm on my second now. So I've worked into
Okay, and what are you doing right now? If you can talk about that.
Yeah. I can talk about that. We're working on, I guess you can say it's kind of like a Monzo clone. So I'm not sure if you know, there is this online, e-bank, exactly. So we're building something like that, but for more like enterprise oriented for like bigger clients. And we're using like AWS and all started with ASP.NET Core, like the latest technologies of the batch. And so it's pretty cool to just try out a bunch of new things at once.
And have you ever had the chance to look at Java?
Yeah, actually, one of the projects that I had to do for freelancing was in Java. Actually, like I said, I used C# for freelancing, but sometimes I had some, like when I started out especially, there were some jobs which are like, help me do my homework assignment, for example, or something along those lines. And some of those were in different languages like Python, sometimes in C++, sometimes in Java. And so I built like very small programs in them. So I can't really say I know either Java or Python or anything, but I wrote something in it.
And you liked Java, or was it like strange experience, or what was your opinion back then?
It was definitely strange coming from C#. A lot of things were similar, but at the same time kind of different. I remember like generics surprised me because generics in C# are I guess separate types that are built in compile time, while in Java I think it uses type erasure. So it kind of just replaces that with just the objects or something. So like working with that was kind of surprising, and I don't remember exactly what else, like what kind of impressions I had, but I remember it was like there was something I was used to, and Java looked very similar to C#, but still functioned differently.
Yeah. I will have to learn C#, then you get feedback from me one time. So what I don't like is if C# developers do something with Java because they use different coding conventions. So we use the camel case, and I think your methods are always uppercase. And I look at your code from your blog post, and this is hard to read for me because it looks like class, but it's actually a method. And then if I used to this, it's no problem at all. But at the beginning, it is almost impossible to read C# because it looks familiar but completely different. So this is actually funny. And I think C# is one of the Vue languages which does that, right? With the
I actually don't know any other. Yeah. So.
And you like that actually, now, or is it strange to you as well? Because you know different programming languages as well. So the coding conventions or naming conventions in C#, you like them or not?
I have no opinion. Actually, I like that they exist. So I like that everybody follows the same thing. But I also like on a daily basis, I also write TypeScript or JavaScript like all the time, and the convention there are like all camel case essentially. Or I mean, there are some different conventions, but it's kind of weird actually. But it also is completely fine for me. And even like when I read Java code, like you said, and there's like lowercase methods, it's fine. Like I can adjust really quickly and it doesn't bother me.
I could actually adjust to C# very quickly. What I don't like at all was the Ruby. So I try now, if everyone said, Ruby is beautiful, and look at the code, so for me it's not beautiful at all. And I think C# would work after a while. But right now it's completely confusing because it looks to me completely different what it actually is. So, and what you did in the first company, because I just would like to, I just misuse you, to find out the typical use cases for .NET Core, because I hear sometimes .NET Core, I had no idea what people were building with .NET Core. So that you building eBank software like Monzo with C#, right? C# and .NET Core, or different languages right now?
Yeah, it's C# .NET Core. And just to clarify, we're building the backend part of it.
Okay.
And also like the front-facing, some front-facing parts like using TypeScript. But then there are also other languages involved for like the mobile app and stuff.
Sorry, are you using Angular in the front end?
No, we're using React. Actually, some teams use Angular as well, but we're using React on ours.
Yeah, very good. So I cannot get Angular at all. So Angular is the strangest framework. React is absolutely fine.
Yeah, and actually I've found that a lot of .NET people kind of like lean towards Angular. So you'll find that like the default choice seems to be like if you're using .NET on the backend, you would use Angular in the front end.
The same in Java. Enterprise Java developers would like to have Angular, and because they have dependency injection, but this is modules, but this is for me, it's complete strange choice.
Yeah, it seems similar to user, like, it's something I already know. But once you get into it, I guess you realize it's not really that similar, and I personally like React a lot more.
Yeah, there's less magic involved. And clearer, And what I do right now is I even replace React with web components and lit HTML. So it looks like React, but it is nothing. It's just, just JavaScript and web standards, but it's a different story. Okay, cool. And what you did before in the company?
Yeah, in the previous company, on the previous job, I actually worked on a cloud solution. So it's like so it's a medical company. It produced medical hardware and also has some software on it as well. And basically it had a lot of hardware and software. And they needed a solution that basically lets people install essentially like the latest version of the software for their hardware, and also taking into account stuff like whether they are licensed, like based on the country, you might not be licensed to the very latest version. For example, Korea takes a long time to approve stuff. And then also like some reseller restrictions, country restrictions, and all those kind of like regulatory stuff, because it's medical equipment that's very critical. And so we built a cloud solution that kind of just provides it provides all those software clients that they can just use to download updates. But on the back end, it's like a solution that you can, first of all, from the administrative perspective, you can log in and add like new versions and add some components and maybe like language files and stuff. And from the like client perspective, you can use it to download new stuff. And there's like blob storage, databases, and queues and everything.
Also C# and .NET Core.
Yeah, all of it in .NET. Yeah.
So now the question in Ukraine or worldwide, if you have what is actually the popularity of .NET Core? Are there more .NET projects or Java projects? Because for me, it's everything Java. So I never saw, in my world, a .NET Core project, I have to admit. So what's your impression? Is everything .NET and nothing Java, or what?
Well, I've never had problems finding .NET jobs, so I think it's popular enough at least. But it's even in Ukraine, if you consider other languages, it loses to JavaScript for sure. Like everybody is using JavaScript, but then I think it also loses to Java in popularity. But I think it's light, so it's probably almost exactly the same. And I also noticed, like from my environment, but also I think just by seeing what people are talking about online, that a lot more people are starting to get into .NET since it was open source and became more open in general. So I think it's getting more popular. And there was like a Stack Overflow survey that they do every year, I think, where they ask you what's your like favorite framework. And I think the most loved framework this year was ASP.NET Core actually. So it's kind of fun.
ASP.NET Core.
Yeah, it's again like the namings, but basically this is the web framework that runs on .NET Core.
Yeah, and okay, so let's briefly about ASP.NET Core. It's like you have the view layer, which is like tags, right? So you have like
not anymore. It's like the name is very outdated. The name stands for Active Server Pages, which goes way back, like when
GSP,
it was like
Java Server Pages.
Yeah. Yes, but nowadays it's kind of like Node.js Express. So it's basically like it's a web server. You can compose it from different components. So you can have a web API, so it only just sends JSON back, for example, and has like routing. You can use like controllers, or you can use endpoints, or you can use CQRS. And like there's a lot of stuff, so you can build any web application with it.
So it is more or less like in Java we would have like not application server, more like modern platforms where you can just write in lambdas, or how is it in C# is not. You have lambdas in C#? No.
Yeah.
Lambdas?
Yeah, they do.
With lambdas, like you can quickly build, the web API saying like get with on whatever, right? So it's just like leading way to routing and stuff like that. And the ASP's classic. The concept is already gone. What I remember, there was like Razor project where they had an MVC, right?
No, yeah, that's the thing is still you can still use it, and thing is they actually improved on it. So, back in the day, it was kind of like ASP.NET Web Forms and ASP.NET like MVC with Razor, like what you were saying, and then there's also ASP.NET Web API. All of that is kind of consolidated into just ASP.NET Core, and you just basically you plug in what you need, so you don't have everything out of the box. You can just do whatever you need for your project. And there's still a way to use Razor for the view. So you can, instead of just returning JSON, you can return a view that generates HTML based off of the Razor templating engine. So there's one way, but they also work on something called Blazor, which is a technology that allows you to, the original idea is to use WebAssembly so that everything on the front end is essentially running on .NET. And so you can use still Razor markup, but then render it on the front end instead of sending it from the server side. So that's also a possibility.
Also off-topic question, but you mentioned pluggability. And in Java is actually the same. So the trend is now you can compose from pieces, whatever you like. And we have also the possibility, to have the complete environment. And then you can just, it's called the micro profile API or Jakarta API. And you get everything, and you just use whatever is there. So for me, I like the complete part because it's very easy to start with. The problem is you have lots of small projects, and if I have the pluggability decision made, then what I have to do is I have each time I have to add I need whatever, I need JSON serialization, I need REST, so I have to think about I need metrics, so I have to add over and over again the same stuff, which is really boring. So what's your opinion? Do you like the modularity as developer, or would you prefer, to get from .NET everything at once?
I like it when I basically only have exactly what I need. Like I really like this aspect of control when you just, you have a problem and you want to solve it, and you just use exactly the right tools for it, and nothing more, nothing less. So in that sense, I think pluggability makes it possible to achieve that. And so that I like, but also something from what you described resonates with me. So sometimes it happens that, what exactly do I need to use to get it to work and stuff? But eventually it kind of just disappears after a while because you already learned. And in my experience, you seem to be doing more or less the same things. Like if you're doing web API, it's very unlikely you'll be switching from web API to some like view-based web application very often. So you just remember what exactly you need. And of course, there's also like templates, so you can start with a template which already has, like for a specific use case, everything you need.
Exactly. What I do in Java is exactly this. So I just end up having my own templates, and this is basically copy and paste. So of the new project, I just add all the dependencies, which is actually pointless because before then there was no template. It came with the framework, This is funny observation. So why we are talking is, someone pointed to you, I think. I even don't know what happened is, and you wrote an excellent article about unit tests.
Yeah.
So I can explain you the situation in my world. So what we have a tool called Sonar. You know Sonar?
Yeah, that's for code analysis.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I'm also spend my time in larger projects, but I'm not working. I'm still freelancer, and I'm working for many projects, and my clients, they are larger projects, and the managers always want to have some numbers or statistics, just say, okay, this is good enough. And what happens is they install Sonar and they say, we need 80% code coverage. For unknown reasons, 80% is seems to be the number. I guess there was an article or book which says, 80%. And the developers say, okay, you will get it. And then they've write, absolute pointless unit tests and for everything. Right. And to achieve the 80%. And in Java, I would just, can just give Java examples. So they do stuff like they invoke default constructors, just to increase, the code coverage. They invoke toString. I don't know whether you have toString in .NET. It's just a pointless method, right? Then enums. So there's enumeration. So they go through the enumeration to increase, the code cover. And in Java, it just cannot break. What I know is in C# you have not getters and setters. You have more like in JavaScript. You have accessors, right? What you can do in C#, you can invoke
their properties.
Properties, exactly. Yeah. So you can invoke a how to call it, a field, and you can intercept that with getters and setters afterwards, right?
Yeah.
In Java, we don't have it yet, and what sometimes this is optional. But what developers tend to do is to generate getters and setters upfront for everything, and just because IDE does that, right? Now, and then you have the problem, of course, lots of methods which are uncovered. So they invoke in unit tests getters and setters, but they cannot break because they just set and get the values. This is like, millions of lines of codes of pointless code. And then the worst of all, you get the 80% code coverage, and actually you didn't test anything. So at the end, everything was invoked, but nothing was tested.
Right.
So and even worse. So I give you another example. So we have probably similar to the ASP.NET. So in Java we use called accessors. So you have a class with annotations, and usually the architectural point of view is this class is just used as a thin wrapper around the business logic. So what it just does is it creates, let's say, HTTP response, the response codes. It does simplistic type conversions. And I actually never test this class because it has no business logic. So then of course, it lowers the code coverage. So what a developer do is, this is what you described in your article. It's just identical in my world. They say if someone invokes response once, then it is okay. If twice is not okay. But what they are doing, they are writing in unit tests, exactly this what happened in the implementation.
Yeah.
And then it increases, the maintenance because every change in business logic you have to change the unit tests, and it is absolutely pointless. So what I tell the managers is, if you build let's say a computer and you will just click on every button of the keyboard, this is the unit test. It will never turn it on. And then the end, it will say, okay, now it should work, right? And what's interesting, you are the first, which publicly said, or what I saw, exactly the same what I was saying for a long time from Java, and you did the same experience in C#. And even the test pyramid, from my perspective, is completely pointless for backend projects, because if something fails in Java, it fails because concurrency or the modules are not working well together, and usually, we are just talking to database. There is not like huge amount of business logic involved. We are just better database browsers. And so what we are testing is pointless code. And what remains is the code which can break, and it is never tested. So
exactly.
So what's interesting is the C# projects tend to have exactly the same experience. So explain you from your perspective what you see in projects. So because you wrote the article, I think you made similar experiences, right?
Yeah. Actually, it's funny because I don't see that 80% coverage requirement all that often.
Okay.
But developers, like every team I worked on, developers always knew they had to write tests. And the problem was that they knew for some reason they thought they had to run unit tests specifically. And like my biggest issue and why I wrote the article was because oftentimes when people think about tests, they immediately think about unit testing, and that often just isn't the right, approach. And I, inside the article, I also explain why it ended up being like this. Like, why did we decide that development testing should be done through unit testing, and also because of the pyramid. But like you said, it's not universal, because if you're going to focus on unit tests, it's only going to depend, like their effectiveness is going to depend on how much business logic you have. And if you're developing some, crazy banking mainframe, there's probably going to be a lot of it, and you probably might get a lot of effort from it, return on investment from it. But then if you do something like a CRUD application, which is like the extreme opposite, right? Then there's going to be no business logic whatsoever. There's going to be a lot of integrations with different components and stuff, and you gain absolutely nothing from unit testing. But the pyramid kind of insists that there's always this structure that you have to follow with like the separation, and no matter what project essentially. And so people kind of just apply it everywhere, and they see that, well, we have to do a lot of unit testing because it's the bottom of the pyramid, the biggest part of it. And so they start with unit testing, they unit test everything, but they don't really stop to think whether that kind of testing actually provides them with any confidence or value in the long run.
Yeah. In Java, there is another story behind that is what you get the statistics for free for unit tests. So if you write unit tests, the code coverage comes for free. But integration tests or system tests are harder to get the code coverage from because you will have to install specific agents in the runtime which will gather the statistics and push them to the Sonar. So this is the main reason that in Java it is a lot harder to get the code coverage for system or not a lot harder. It's different. It doesn't come out of the box. A lot harder means it is one line of code you have to know, right, and then you have to copy a file. This is harder, right? But still something to do, and therefore they go with the default. And in the default case, they only see unit test code coverage, and before they are driven by the metrics, then the unit test code coverage is paramount, because if you are external developer and you are judged by the client by the quality of the or by the statistics, then you will write more code unit tests, because otherwise you won't pass the quality gates. So they completely ignore integration and system tests, because this integration and system tests don't generate any stats.
Yeah.
And what I do in projects, we prescribe cyclomatic complexity, and cyclomatic complexity means 3 is for instance if else. So we have cyclomatic complexity of 3. If I have the power, I say, okay, you are not allowed to unit test code if the cyclomatic complexity is lower than 3, because then they cannot just write unit test code for a unit test for getters and setters, right? Which is pointless, or default constructors or enums. So at least that, and
that's smart actually.
Yeah, this is a fight, you cannot imagine, because I'm a freelancer and they are from different companies. They are managers, and they have already all the templates in place and whatever. And I come in and say what you are doing is pointless, and this is of course every time 1 day meeting. But this cyclomatic complexity. And are you aware of mutation testing?
Yeah, but I haven't actually actively been using it.
Yeah, I can just tell you how it works in Java, because it also solves the problem. Because what mutation PyTest, for instance, is one framework. I don't know whether it's available for C#, but in Java. And in the mutation testing, what it does is it modifies the business code. And this modification is expected to be caught by the asserts. So what means is, so the mutants has to be caught. So this is the idea, right? So verified. And what happens in my project is there are 2 kinds of unit tests. So pointless unit tests. One pointless unit test is they invoke a lot and assert nothing. So you have a huge invocation chain, and at the end you see assert no null or assert true. Yeah. And then the mutation will fail. And the other thing is they don't test the actual business logic. They test what happened inside the method. Every call in the method is verified with unit test. So then the mutation testing will still green or won't fail, but it's still pointless. But the problem with the mutation testing is because the bytecode is modified several times. So there's your production bytecode is modified, and in the hope the unit test will catch the modification. It is a little bit slower. But this is also an interesting hack to do in projects.
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting. And I've had a thought about code coverage, because I use this as a metric in my own projects and the projects I work on. But the thing I've found is that as a metric, it's only the most useful when it says 0%, because then there is absolutely no testing done, and that actually conveys some information. But whenever it's anything but that, 1 or 10 or even 100%, you have no idea what is the extent of testing. It only tells you that everything has been exercised, but like you said, it might not assert anything. So you can do add 2 numbers, but then don't check the result. You'll still get 100% coverage. And it only really makes sense. If you see 80%, it's only going to give you some reassurance or assurance at all, if you know what is the quality of the tests that provided that coverage. If you've written them, that, okay, then it's probably good 80% coverage. If you just come into a new project and you see 80%, you have no idea whether it's actually valuable 80% or not.
Yeah. And in Java, we have also confusion, the naming test naming is like terrible. So what I did is I always, take the names from Wikipedia because they are the easiest accessible. And it's like unit test is the smallest unit. I would just do it for methods with significant amount of business logic, cyclomatic code complexity.
Yeah.
And it's no more available, but a few versions back of Sonar Source, what we had is a decent metric. It combined the cyclomatic complexity with test coverage. So what we did, I think it was called project word count. The larger the font of the class, the complex it is, and the color was test coverage. So what we did, there was like a huge dash, and I said, okay, whatever you do, large red font is forbidden, and small green font is suspicious.
Oh, I see.
And this was great. So something like this would actually work, right? And the integration tests in Java are a little bit more than unit tests. So you will test 3-4 classes. Like what we usually do is we start a Java class with access to database without starting the runtime. So we can start the server, or we can just start the database. So I have the opportunity to test, for instance, SQL statements without ASP.NET, or in my world, without accessors. So this is useful. And the most useful test is system test, black box.
Yeah.
And what I do in my project, a hack, so I'm curious about your opinion, is I'm starting the runtime with code coverage agent turn on. Then I run my system test from outside. And then I expect the code coverage being relatively high because now I'm calling all the public APIs. And the cool story is I misuse code coverage to identify that code. So I'm misusing it, because if something is not called, the question is why. Is it, my test is not as good, or is forgotten code? In my case, it's always forgotten code. So I just misuse code coverage to identify and delete forgotten code.
I actually do the same. I usually look at I use CodeCov to submit my code coverage to, and then it shows a heat map, and you can browse the files that haven't been covered that well. And I also do this I write black box tests first, and whenever I can, I start from those, and then I look at the coverage and see which classes have not been tested, and try to figure out why as well. And usually it's also because it might be because I forgot some feature and then I add it, but it also might be because it just isn't used, or it's used but not actually in a real scenario or something like this.
Hey, cool. Which tool are you using for that? Is it?
So there is this website called codecov.io, and it basically lets you submit different code coverage reports in JSON, Covertura, and stuff, and then it parses them and visualizes them in a nice interface. But in .NET, to collect coverage, we have a tool called Coverlet, which is just a library. There's kind of in .NET, there is private dependencies. So you can have a library that doesn't get exported, if you package it or something. And so you can use this Coverlet runtime library to basically instrument your code during development so that it reports when it was called. And then based off of that, it collects coverage statistics. So you can use it for integration testing, for end-to-end testing, for anything. And you don't even have to write any lines, just add a package. That's it.
So it just hooks into your runtime, probably. It has to modify Do you have bytecode.net? How it's called?
It's called IL, intermediate language, and it's kind of like bytecode. The way it works is essentially if it's built during testing, and then it just after compilation, it changes the assembly so that it injects additional code. And so when the tests execute any code that eventually gets calls that assembly, all of that extra code that it injected will report what are the methods that were called or how they were called and stuff like this. But then when you run it in real environment, all of that instrumentation code is not added.
In Java, we have Jacoco, it's an agent, and the agent just hooks into the tests, so it knows what's invoked and what's not invoked, and it produces one file called jacoco.exec. And if you have that file, you can submit it to a IntelliJ, for instance, or to whatever you have, and you get the nice colored syntax, what was invoked and what wasn't exactly. And what I also a huge fan of are stress tests. So stress test means torture tests. So what I try to do is to generate a high load and see how my runtime behaves, to see, do we have enough threads, enough memory, do we have some deadlocks? Because as a freelancer, I spent a lot of time in firefighting projects, something didn't work, and usually was memory leaks, was always, concurrency. This is ignored in most projects completely. They most of the enterprise Java projects, they do as if they were single-threaded. So no stress test at all. And so I do it actually a lot. So from my perspective, the black box and stress tests are the most valuable tests at the end. And the unit and integration test, from my opinion, is more or less, I'm too lazy to start the runtime, so I've write different tests to write faster code, to write code faster or more productive without starting the runtime. So what's your take on the stress test? Do something as well in C#? Or
we usually call it load testing. So there are tools for that, and if you can use anything, like even from something that's not built in C# because you're essentially just sending requests usually, so it doesn't really matter. And most of on the current project that I'm working on, we actually do that as well to make sure that whatever we wrote actually withstands load of maybe 100 users per second or something at least. And I think it's very valuable. I think it's one of those things that people often forget about, that you can have everything tested, like all of your separate components may work correctly, but then if the user can't extract any value from that, it doesn't matter. Like, for example, you may have 99% code coverage on all of your classes in your code, but then something was configured incorrectly in routing, and so when the user goes to a URL, they end up on a 404 page. Then it doesn't really matter. It's the same with load. If your site is down, then it doesn't matter if you have 100% test coverage. It's not going to help anyway.
And of course, we have lots of microservice patterns, circuit breakers, timeouts, and whatever. And you have also tests whether they're actually working and generate the expected metrics and stats. So it was a really nice conversation the first time, with someone from the .NET world. And where people can find you. So do you have some, your blog, what is the name of the article? Actually, I wrote it down. It was
it's titled Unit Testing is Overrated. And I actually thought a lot about the name, and I decided to go with this. I know it sounds a little bit clickbaity, but I think it's really what I'm trying to tell everyone, that, they're overrated. They're not bad or anything, but people place too much faith in them. And so, my blog, there's this article, and then you can also read some others if you want. And also, I'm on Twitter. It's twitter.com/TYRRRZ. So hopefully you'll have a link.
What's the story?
It's a long story. It's actually from my childhood. So, I had to find a nickname for an online game at some point, and I ended up with Tyr, the Norwegian or the Nordic mythology god. But it worked for that game. But for any other account I tried to register, it was too few characters, or it was already taken. So I had to become creative, and with the creativity I have, I just added R's to the end. Okay. And then at some point, that wasn't enough, so I added the Z. And finally, with that combination, nobody had the same nickname anymore.
Cool story, actually. Cool.
Yeah.
And if you like, just send me the links to the tools you are using in .NET. So I will. Yeah. And if you like, also name of your company, if you like. So and. In some point in the future, I can re-invite you back to talk, about the progress in this, or React and front end, whatever. It was fun to have a conversation with a non-Java developer, because in my ecosystem it's just Java. I never had the opportunity to have a talk with C# people. So thank you a lot.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. It was a very nice experience for me.